2,000 years of unbroken tradition, 118 cardinals who had gathered from across the earth to elect a man they believed they could manage, and a single morning, just weeks into his pontificate, when the walls of the apostolic palace fell absolutely silent, and every man inside them understood that something had changed forever. That morning was not the one they had planned for. It was not the ceremony, not the audience, not the carefully choreographed press event. It was the moment a white-haired curial official walked out of a private meeting with the new pope, sat down in a corridor chair, and did not speak for 40 minutes. The moment that mattered was not the speeches. It was the silence that came after. Robert Francis Prevost had not been the obvious choice. The cardinal from Chicago, who had spent the better part of 3 decades in the Peruvian highlands, leading a diocese few in Rome could point to on a map, did not belong to any of the great curial factions. He had no palace debts to repay. He owed nothing to the corridors. And that, as the men who elected him would discover in the weeks that followed, was precisely the problem. This is the story of what happened when a pope decided the institution he had inherited needed to change, and what the institution decided to do about it. The Vatican is, by any reasonable measure, one of the most complex bureaucratic organisms on earth. Centuries of accumulated precedent, unwritten protocol, and carefully balanced power have made it a place where decisions that appear theological are almost always also political, and decisions that appear political are sometimes quietly theological. The men who run its dicasteries, the offices that govern everything from doctrine to finance to diplomatic relations, are not merely administrators. They are inheritors of something much older, a particular vision of how the Church ought to be governed and by whom. When Leo XIV began asking questions that had not been asked before, those men recognized the shape of the challenge immediately. The first indication came in late May, less than 3 weeks after the white smoke rose above the Sistine Chapel. A senior curial cardinal, a man who had served under 3 consecutive popes and who managed one of the Vatican's most powerful offices, received a summons to a private meeting with the new pontiff. This was not unusual in itself. What was unusual was the subject of the meeting, which, according to multiple sources within the Curia, centered on a single document, an internal audit of financial arrangements that had never been made public, arrangements that touched on relationships between certain Vatican institutions and external financial entities that, in the Pope's own words, required what he called complete transparency and a thorough accounting. The cardinal who left that meeting and sat in the corridor chair for 40 minutes had served the Church for 51 years. What Pope Leo XIV had discovered, or rather what he had chosen to act upon, was not entirely new information. Reforming pontiffs before him had circled the same territory. John Paul II had spoken of the need for institutional renewal. Benedict XVI had created commissions. Francis had reorganized entire dicasteries, launched financial reforms, and endured the resulting turbulence for a decade. But each of those men, in their different ways, had worked with the existing architecture of curial power, adjusting, redirecting, appealing. Leo XIV appeared to have decided on a different approach. The document he placed before the cardinal that morning in May was not a commission report. It was not a recommendation from a consultative body. It was a direct papal order, 3 pages, written in clear canonical language, requiring the immediate disclosure of all financial relationships between the dicastery in question and any external institution, the suspension of 2 specific contractual arrangements pending review, and the appointment of an external auditor with authority independent of the curial structure itself. The order carried the full weight of papal authority. There was, canonically speaking, no appeal. The cardinal read it twice. Then he left. Word moved through the apostolic palace the way it always moves, not through official channels, but through the older, quieter networks that have connected the offices of the Roman Curia for generations. By the afternoon, 3 other senior officials had made quiet inquiries to their own canon lawyers. By the following morning, a small group of men, all of them holders of offices that would come within the scope of the new transparency requirements, had begun meeting privately to discuss what one participant would later describe simply as the situation. They didn't call it a revolt. None of them would have used that word. What they called it, in the careful language of men who have spent their lives navigating institutional politics, was a question of proper consultation and collegial process. The substance of the concern, stripped of its diplomatic vocabulary, was this: the Pope was moving too fast without sufficient consultation of the affected offices, and the measures he was proposing would, in the phrase that circulated through those early private meetings, fundamentally alter the character of curial governance. What they meant, though they didn't say it plainly, was that the measures would transfer power away from the offices that currently held it and toward a form of accountability that the offices had never before been asked to accept. It is worth pausing here to understand the geography of what was happening, because the Vatican's internal conflicts are almost always misunderstood by the outside world as theological disputes, when they are in fact very often disputes about something much more ordinary: control. The Roman Curia is not a monolith. It is a collection of fiefdoms, each with its own institutional culture, its own long memory, and its own understanding of where it stands in relation to the Pope who happens to be reigning at any given moment. Some dicasteries have been effectively autonomous for so long that the idea of direct papal oversight feels, to the men who run them, not merely uncomfortable, but categorically wrong, a violation of an order of things that predates any individual papacy and will outlast it. The men who gathered in those private meetings were not cynics. It would be a mistake to understand them that way. Many of them believed, with genuine conviction, that the structures they were protecting were essential to the Church's ability to function. They had seen what happened when reform moved too quickly: the administrative confusion, the institutional whiplash, the loss of continuity that could take years to repair. Their opposition to what Leo XIV was doing was not purely self-interested. It was also, in its own way, ideological. But it was also self-interested. That is the honest accounting. The meetings grew in number through June. 5 participants became 9. The original informal gathering took on a more deliberate quality: a regular time, a regular place, a shared understanding that what was being discussed required discretion. A senior Vatican journalist who had covered the Holy See for more than 2 decades later described what he heard of those meetings as the most organized internal resistance to a pontificate since the early years of Francis, but quieter, more controlled, and in some ways more dangerous because of it. The danger lay not in any dramatic action. No one in those rooms was contemplating anything that could be called rebellion in any visible sense, but in the accumulated weight of institutional inertia that a coordinated group of senior officials could deploy almost invisibly. Delays in implementation, requests for further clarification that would require additional consultation, referrals to bodies that would take months to convene. The Vatican's bureaucratic machinery, wielded with precision by men who had spent careers mastering it, could slow almost any directive to a standstill without ever openly defying it. And so the Pope's financial transparency order sat, not rejected, not refused, simply pending. Pending clarification, pending review, pending the outcome of a consultative process that had been initiated to ensure that all relevant parties were properly included. Pope Leo XIV had been watching the Church's internal machinery for long enough to recognize what was happening. The years in Peru had not kept him away from institutional politics. If anything, they had given him a clearer view of it, the kind of clarity that comes from watching an institution's effects on the ground rather than from within its own self-referential culture. He knew what a well-executed bureaucratic slowdown looked like. He had seen it applied to episcopal reform efforts in his own diocese. He did not respond publicly. He did not summon the group. He did not issue a statement. What he did in mid-June was quieter and more deliberate. He began a series of private meetings of his own, not with curial officials, but with a different set of people: canon lawyers outside the Vatican structure, financial experts who had worked on church reform in other countries, and crucially, a small number of cardinals who were not members of the Curia and had no stake in the existing arrangements. The meetings were not secret in any technical sense, but they were quiet and the people he met with were chosen with care. By early July, the shape of what Leo XIV was assembling had begun to become visible to those watching closely. He was not simply trying to push through the original financial transparency order against the resistance of the Curia. He was building something different, a new structure of oversight, parallel to the existing curial architecture that would not depend on the cooperation of the offices being overseen. An independent body with direct papal authority, staffed by people from outside the Vatican's existing power networks, with a mandate that could not be quietly strangled by institutional delay. When the announcement came, not as a press conference, not as a formal document presented through existing curial channels, but as an apostolic letter issued directly from the papal office on a Tuesday afternoon in July, the officials who had been meeting through June received it with the particular stillness of men who had just realized they had been outmaneuvered. The letter was 16 pages. It established a new pontifical commission for institutional transparency, with membership drawn from canon lawyers, certified public accountants, and former heads of state financial regulatory bodies from 5 different countries. The commission's mandate gave it authority to request documents from any Vatican institution. Its findings would be reported directly to the Pope, and through him, made available for publication. No curial office had veto power over its work. No existing institution could claim exemption from its scope. It was, by any measure, a significant document. But the paragraph that was quoted most widely in the days that followed was not the one establishing the Commission's powers. It was a short passage near the end, written in a different register from the careful canonical language that surrounded it, less formal, more direct, carrying the unmistakable quality of something that had not been written by a committee. It read, in translation, "The Church does not belong to its administrators. It belongs to the people it was given to serve. Every arrangement that cannot be shown to those people in clear light is an arrangement that should be examined and, if necessary, changed." A Monsignor who had served in the Secretariat of State for 30 years read that paragraph, put down the letter, and said to the colleague sitting across from him, "He means it." That was the moment. Not the financial order in May, not the quiet July announcement, but that paragraph and the recognition it carried, when the men who had been meeting through June understood that what they were facing was not a new pope still finding his footing. It was a settled intention. The response that followed was not a capitulation. It would be inaccurate to say the resistance collapsed. What happened was more complicated and, in its own way, more revealing of how the Vatican actually works. Some officials moved toward compliance, not enthusiastically, but with the pragmatic recognition that an independent commission with direct papal authority was not a structure that could be defeated by bureaucratic delay. Others continued to explore, through careful canonical channels, whether the commission's mandate could be constrained or its timeline extended. A third group, smaller but significant, began making quiet contact with Vatican journalists, not to leak documents, but to shape a narrative, that the Pope's reforms, however well-intentioned, were creating confusion and instability, that the proper path was consultation and gradualism, that the speed of the changes was itself a problem regardless of their content. That last effort was, in some respects, the most sophisticated of the three, because it correctly identified the point of vulnerability in any reforming pontificate, the gap between what a pope intends and what the world sees, and the ease with which that gap can be filled by voices that have spent decades cultivating relationships with the journalists who cover the Holy See. It is worth understanding how that particular mechanism works, because it is older than any living Vatican observer and has been deployed, with varying degrees of success, against reforming popes going back centuries. The Vatican press corps is a small world. The correspondents who cover the Holy See full-time number in the dozens rather than the hundreds, and many of them have built careers of 20 or 30 years in a city where the primary currency of journalism is access. Access to officials who will speak candidly, who will confirm or deny, who will provide the context that turns an official communiqué into a story that actually illuminates something. The officials who had spent those careers cultivating those relationships knew their value precisely. A well-placed comment to the right correspondent, framed as genuine concern from a trusted source, did not require any falsehood. It required only selective emphasis, a particular angle on events that were genuinely complex, an interpretation of ambiguous facts that happened to favor a particular institutional interest. Done well, it was invisible as strategy. It simply looked like reporting. And for a time, it worked. The narrative of Vatican uncertainty that circulated through Catholic media in July carried enough surface plausibility, because the changes were genuinely disruptive, and disruption genuinely produces uncertainty, that it required no defense and invited no obvious rebuttal. A pope who responded to it directly would have appeared defensive. One who ignored it allowed it to accumulate. Leo XIV did neither. It produced a wave of reporting, careful, well-sourced reporting from correspondents who genuinely believed what they were being told, about uncertainty within the Vatican, concerns among experienced officials, the risks of moving too quickly. None of it was fabricated. All of it was curated. Pope Leo XIV read the coverage. He is known to read widely and to read carefully. He did not respond to it directly. Instead, he gave a homily on a morning in late July, an ordinary Wednesday general audience homily not marked as anything special, in which he spoke, without any apparent reference to current events, about the story of the money changers in the temple. He spoke about what it means for an institution to mistake its own convenience for sacred necessity. He spoke, in a passage that became widely circulated, about the difference between the house of God and the houses men build inside it and come to believe are the same thing. The homily was 40 minutes long. The passage that traveled furthest was 3 sentences. Every human institution accumulates the sediment of its own interests over time. That is not a sin. The sin is to call the sediment sacred, to insist that what has grown up in the house of God is therefore the house of God itself and cannot be touched. In the corridor outside the hall, a young curial official said quietly to a colleague, "He's not going to stop." He was not going to stop. And that recognition, arriving at different moments for different people within the Vatican's complex internal world, began to change the character of the resistance. Because the most durable form of institutional opposition is not confrontation. Confrontation can be resolved. The most durable form is the slow realignment of individuals who calculate, each in their own way, which side of a long-term transformation they wish to be on. Through August, the Commission began its work. Its first requests for documents went out to 4 dicasteries. 3 responded within the specified timeline. 1 did not, and the fact of its non-response was noted in the Commission's first interim report, which was, per the terms of the apostolic letter, made public. The name of the dicastery appeared in a Vatican news report the following morning. Its prefect issued a statement the same day, explaining that the delay was the result of administrative complexity and would be resolved shortly. The documents arrived within 48 hours. It was a small thing, in isolation. A minor administrative episode in the vast machinery of a 2,000-year-old institution. But within the Vatican, it was understood as something more. It was the first time in living memory that a curial office had been publicly identified as non-compliant with a papal directive, and had been visibly required to comply anyway, without any softening of the requirement, without any face-saving adjustment to the timeline, without any private accommodation that would have allowed the matter to remain invisible. The silence that followed that 48-hour window was of a different quality from the silence that had followed the original financial order in May. That earlier silence had been the silence of men deciding what to do. This silence was the silence of men who had seen what not complying actually looked like. There is a word that circulates in Vatican internal culture, a Latin word that has no precise English equivalent but which translates roughly as prudent discernment, and it describes the quality that senior officials invoke when they wish to justify a pause before acting on something they would prefer not to act on. Prudent discernment requires time. It requires consultation. It requires that all dimensions of a question be examined before any irreversible step is taken. It is, in the hands of skilled institutional operators, an essentially infinite resource. A question can always be discerned more prudently. A process can always benefit from additional consultation. And the result is that things which appear to require action can be held in a state of dignified suspension indefinitely without anyone ever having openly refused anything. The Commission had been designed with some care to make that mechanism unavailable. Its timelines were specific, its requests carried a formal requirement of response, and its reporting structure, directly to the Pope and then publicly, meant that non-response was itself a fact that would be documented and disclosed. Inside one of the offices that had received a document request, a senior official, a man with 30 years of Vatican service and a realistic sense of institutional arithmetic, made a phone call to a colleague in a different dicastery. The phone call lasted 20 minutes. When it ended, the official sat for a moment at his desk, then began drafting a response to the Commission's request that went somewhat beyond what had been technically required. He included context, explanation, additional supporting materials. He sent it before the deadline. He was not the only one. It was, in its own small way, a turning point. Not because the act of sending documents early was dramatic, it was not, but because it represented something that institutional observers within the Vatican recognized, the beginning of individual recalculation. Each person within a bureaucratic structure makes their own private accounting of where power is flowing and where it is not, and adjusts accordingly. The man who sent his documents early was not a convert. He was a pragmatist. But pragmatism, in the direction of transparency, produces the same result as conviction. And in a body as large and complex as the Roman Curia, individual recalculations, accumulating across dozens of offices and hundreds of officials, eventually produce something that looks from a distance like institutional change. The Commission's second interim report, released in September, was longer than the first. It noted areas of full compliance and areas requiring further examination. It did not single out individuals. Its language was precise and institutional. But embedded within that precise institutional language was a picture that, for anyone who understood what they were reading, was quietly extraordinary. A detailed accounting of financial relationships that had existed, undisclosed and unexamined, for decades. Nothing in the report was described as corrupt. The Commission had found irregularities, arrangements that could not be justified on any institutional rationale, transfers that appeared to reflect personal relationships rather than institutional purposes, contractual commitments whose origins could not be traced to any documented decision. But the Commission was careful not to use language that carried criminal implication. It documented. It described. It asked questions that required answers. The answers, when they came, were sometimes illuminating and sometimes were not. But the act of asking, publicly, with authority, with the expectation of a genuine response, was itself the transformation. Because the Vatican's internal culture had, for a very long time, operated on the assumption that certain questions were simply not asked, not because the answers were known to be bad, but because asking was understood to carry a risk that no individual official had any personal incentive to accept. That assumption was no longer operative. In October, something happened that had not been anticipated by anyone on either side of the struggle. A retired cardinal, a man in his mid-80s, who had served for many years in a senior curial role, and who had, by the time of his retirement, accumulated a reputation as one of the most formidable institutional intelligences in the Vatican, published a brief essay in a Catholic periodical. The essay was not long. It was not dramatic. It was, in the careful measured prose of a man who had spent 50 years choosing his words with precision, a reflection on the nature of institutional reform and the conditions under which it succeeds or fails. The essay's central argument was this: that institutions resist change not primarily because the people within them are opposed to it, but because they cannot see it clearly, because the sediment of accumulated practice has covered the original purpose so thoroughly that the practice has come to feel like the purpose, and removing it feels like a violation rather than a restoration, and that the only reforms which endure are those that succeed in making the original purpose visible again, not by attacking the accumulated practice, but by holding up the purpose beside it and allowing people to see the difference for themselves. He did not mention Pope Leo XIV by name. He did not need to. The essay was read within the Vatican as a significant signal, not because it endorsed the Pope's approach uncritically, but because the man who wrote it had spent his career as a committed institutionalist, a defender of curial culture and curial prerogative, and his willingness to write what he wrote suggested that the calculation of where history was heading had shifted in ways that were not going to reverse. Pope Leo XIV was given a copy of the essay that afternoon. He read it in his private study. The official who delivered it waited outside. When the Pope came to the door, he was holding the essay in one hand. He looked at the official and said, in the quiet, even tone that had become his signature in those months, something that the official later recounted to a colleague. "This is what it looks like when something changes. The struggle is not over. Institutions of this age and complexity do not transform in months. The Commission continues its work. Some offices remain slow to respond. The informal networks that connected the men who gathered through June still exist and still meet, though less frequently now, and with a different quality of purpose. Less about resistance, more about positioning for whatever comes next. But something has shifted in the space of that first, strange, contested year. Not the institution itself, not yet. What has shifted is the understanding of what is possible within it. The assumption that certain questions could not be asked publicly, that certain arrangements were permanently beyond the reach of formal accountability, that the machinery of curial resistance was more durable than any individual papal will, that assumption has been tested and found to be not quite as solid as it appeared. There is a small detail that those who followed this story closely tend to return to because it carries more meaning than any of the large institutional gestures. In late September, a young archivist working in one of the dicasteries that had received a commission document request found, in the course of responding to that request, a folder of correspondence that had been misfiled decades ago. The correspondence was administrative. Nothing dramatic, nothing criminal, nothing that bore on the commission's immediate work. But it contained, among its pages, a handwritten note from a long-dead official dating to the early 1970s, in which he had described his own frustration with precisely the kind of financial opacity that Leo XIV's commission was now examining. The note ended with a sentence that the archivist copied out and quietly shared with a colleague. "One day someone will have to ask about this openly. I hope they are brave enough and that we still have time." The archivist did not know whether to laugh or weep. She did both, she said later. Then she sent the documents to the commission on time. "There are men in Rome tonight who believe the reform will not hold, that it will be absorbed, adjusted, quietly reversed in the years after this pontificate ends, as so many other reforms have been absorbed and adjusted before. They may be right. History offers them ample precedent. There are others who believe something different has happened this time, that the combination of a clear papal intention, a parallel oversight structure that cannot be captured by the existing power networks, and the simple fact of public accountability once established, is genuinely difficult to undo. That what has been made visible cannot be made invisible again without a kind of effort that the institution, watched as it now is, cannot afford. The truth, as it almost always is in stories of this kind, is likely somewhere between those two readings. What can be said with certainty is this: the questions are now being asked. The documents are being produced, the answers are being recorded and made public, and in the corridors of the Apostolic Palace, in the offices where officials once worked with the serene confidence that their arrangements were beyond scrutiny, there is a different atmosphere, something between watchfulness and a particular kind of honesty that institutions seldom discover on their own. The man who made that change happen is a former bishop from the Peruvian highlands, who spent 30 years among people to whom the word transparency was not an institutional policy, but a basic condition of being taken seriously by the church they had given their faith to. He had watched that church fail those people in small ways and large ways, and he had carried that knowledge with him to Rome. When the opportunity came, when the cardinals who believed they had elected a manageable figure placed the keys of the institution in his hands, he did what the people of Chulucanas and Callao and the high Andean villages had been waiting a very long time for someone to do. He asked, and then he waited for the answers. The church has not been transformed. The men who built their careers within the existing architecture of power are still there, still working, still watching. But the Pope who challenged them has not stopped, and the commission whose work they once hoped to delay is still publishing. And the young archivist who found the 50-year-old note is still sending documents on time, and somewhere in those small, unglamorous facts is the shape of something that might, if it holds, matter very much. Whether it holds is the question that will be answered not this year, but in the years after this year, by people who are watching now and will remember what they saw. What they are seeing is this: a man who was handed an institution and decided, quietly and without drama, that the institution could be asked to account for itself. And an institution that has spent 2,000 years outlasting every challenge to its continuity, now confronting the possibility that the challenge it faces this time is not from outside, but from within, and from a place it had not expected. The chair where that cardinal sat for 40 minutes in the corridor outside the Pope's office on that May morning is still there. It is a plain wooden chair, the kind that has furnished Vatican corridors for as long as anyone can remember. It holds no particular significance, but for those who know what happened in the room behind it and what began in that silence, it has come to represent something they find difficult to put into words exactly. Perhaps it is simply this: that change, when it comes to a very old institution, begins not with declarations or confrontations, but with moments when someone in a position of authority asks a question that was not supposed to be asked, waits for an answer that was not supposed to be required, and does not look away. That is where this story begins. And that is where, for now, it rests. If this story of Pope Leo XIV and the quiet transformation of the Church moves you, subscribing means more reporting like this, directly from the Vatican's corridors. And the question to consider leaving in the comments: which moment in this story struck you most? The archivist's discovery, the 40-minute silence, or the cardinal's essay? God bless.